Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, that felt very melodramatic here in the Pillsbury Auditorium at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I want to welcome you, both those of us who are in the audience today and those of us joining us from either home or virtually online. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Minneapolis Institute of Art resides within the traditional territory of the Dakota. The name Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makose, the land where the water reflects the clouds. The Dakota and numerous other indigenous peoples whose cultural, spiritual, and economic practices are intrinsically woven into this landscape consider this land sacred. My name is Nicole Sukup, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and the Coordinator for the Minnesota Arts Exhibition Program here at MIA. Thank you for coming or tuning in today. Today we'll hear Aaron Dysart, a Minneapolis-based artist, discuss his current exhibition, Passage, with Dr. Jessica Hellmann. Their conversation will range in topics from misperceptions of scientific world or the art world versus our shared world, and how ways of knowing and exchange of ways of practice can actually benefit both science and art together, and how all of this feeds into the broader conversations of climate change today. As the artist Jenny Holzer once noted, all things are delicately interconnected. And today's conversation, I think, just reaffirms that concept. So before I introduce Jessica and Aaron and bring them on stage, I want to let you guys know a few things about today's conversation. We will be accepting Q&A from the audience here at MIA after our conversation, which will last about 45 minutes. Unfortunately, we cannot take conversation at this time or questions from the audience viewing at home. However, if you do have questions, please do not hesitate to contact the Contemporary Art Department at contemporary@artsmia.org if you have any questions, and we would be happy to follow up online or via email. So, if you are viewing online, I also want to note the conversation will kind of just abruptly end on your screen. Please know that if you're in the audience today, we will meet you outside of the gallery or the auditorium, as it were, in the gallery or in the fountain court following the conversation. So please do join us, and I hope you have a moment to come and view the exhibition, which is just down the hall to your left in the US Bank Gallery. If you look for the beautifully turning work of art that is an upside down tree root ball, you will find the gallery and you will be in the right space. So with that, and without further ado, let me introduce our today's conversants. Dr. Jessica Hellmann is the director of the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment and the Ecolab Chair in Environmental Leadership. As director, she provides strategic leadership to the Institute, a mission-based organization working to help build a future where people and planet prosper together. In addition to leading the I on E, Jessica is also the Russell M. and Elizabeth M. Bennett Chair in Excellence in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior in the College of Biological Sciences at the U. Her research focuses on climate change ecology, climate adaptation, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. She was among the first to propose and study ways to reduce the impact of climate change through new technologies and conservation management. Hellmann led an important paradigm shift in ecology and natural resource management by showing that adaptation, living with climate change, is crucial to the future of humanity and Earth's ecosystems, as slowing and stopping greenhouse gas emissions. Her research group has also shown the differences in the ways that populations respond to climate change are key to predicting and managing their future. If that was not enough, Jessica also sits on the board of directors at the National Audubon Society, the Science Museum of Minnesota, Compass, and the Great Plains Institute. Prior to her time and tenure at the U of M, she was on faculty at the University of Notre Dame, where she served as research director for Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. In addition, she led the climate change adaptation program at Notre Dame's Environmental Change Initiative and directed GLOBES, an interdisciplinary graduate training program in environment and society, among other responsibilities. She also founded Notre Dame's undergraduate major in sustainability. Jessica earned her PhD in biology from Stanford and served as a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford Centers for International Security and Cooperation and the University of British Columbia Center for Biodiversity Research. She is an alumna of Stanford's prestigious Leopold Leadership Program and the Leshner Leadership Institute at the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, AAS. She is an elected fellow of AAS and the recipient of a Career Enhancement Fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and received the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award of the U.S. Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Today, Jessica will be in conversation with the current Minnesota Arts Exhibition Program awardee, Aaron Dysart. Aaron's work pairs visual language and spectacle to give hidden stories a broader audience, to interject our daily routines, and to give moment for thought and pause and contemplation upon bigger conversations in new and unexpected ways. His environmental interventions showcase his love of color, fog machines, while many of his objects convey meaning through materiality. His current exhibition here on view at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, Passage, melds the poetics of engaging our environment and data visualization. He worked closely with researchers at Woodwell Climate Research Center, formerly known as Woods Hole Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts, to coordinate the data used in his light work, Latitude. When he is not creating profound and beautiful statements for galleries and public art, Aaron is a professor of art at Anoka Ramsey College, and city artist embedded in the city of St. Paul through Public Art St. Paul. Aaron's exhibition, as I had noted, is a part of the MAEP, or Minnesota Exhibition Artist Program. It's a curatorial program founded nearly 50 years ago as a partnership with our local and regional partners who live and work in the state of Minnesota. It has since become an ongoing relationship and an agreement, becoming a unique and one-of-a-kind exhibition programs in the country. The program presents contemporary art within the context of encyclopedia art at the museum. But as today's conversation demonstrates, it does much more than that and provides a platform for how artists engage with our world today and present dynamic, arresting, and profound conversations in ways that we never expected. The program is often the first major exposure for artists who have gone on to critical and commercial success. Aaron's show was selected by a panel of 7 artists who live and work in the state. He was awarded approximately $13,500 to produce this exhibition, but we all know it costs much more than that in time, labor, and energy, and dedication to his subject matter. I encourage you, if you do not have time today or are unable to come to MIA today, to take a moment to come and view the exhibition Passage before it leaves us for the moment. His exhibition will be on view through February 26th. For more information about Aaron, his practice, or any of our upcoming exhibitions, I encourage you to come either to MIA or visit us online at artmia.org. And with that, I would like to invite Jessica and Aaron on stage. So please welcome for both of them. Wow, what an introduction. And I feel like this could either be a wonderful moment of profound introduction to today's conversation, or it can lighten the mood by saying, so an artist and a scientist walk on stage at a museum. So why are we here? So why bring Jessica into conversation with you, Aaron?
When it comes to most exhibitions, there's the kind of rote artist talk. I think it's become kind of standard practice. I get it. I understand people want to learn more. And I've done that, and I can do that. But when Nicole asked, and it's like, is there anything else you want to do? I'm much more interested in using this as a platform for dreams I have, for things I'm interested in, as opposed to just talking about things I do. One of the most profound things that really drives me, that I get fascinated by, is talking with scientists. And one of my theses is thesis is this notion that when artists and scientists team together and influence each other, amazing things can happen. So instead of just kind of giving a standard practice, I'm proud of the show. I can talk to that, and I hope to interject kind of comments about both pieces that are on view next door. I'm much more interested in kind of talking about this, like how the art world and the scientific world are similar, how they're different, and how and why they can learn from each other. So with that, I kind of reached out and be like, who would be amazing to talk about this? I met Jessica through the Ways of Knowing Water, which was a cohort of artists, scientists, and community leaders that was put on by the Weizmann Art Museum, the Institute on the Environment, and the Institute for Advanced Study, along with Water Bar. And I've always had this fascination and love with the Institute on the Environment, complete with its name. It's not about the environment, it's on the environment. And I think those word shifts are very important to me. So we reached out and had a lovely conversation, and here we are.
So Jessica, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this notion of on the environment and your work at the U of M? And as I noted in in the introduction just moments ago, why is it important for you to be here today and to talk about Aaron's work and climate change?
Well, firstly, I have to say a huge thank you and how honored I am to be able to be a tiny piece of showcasing Aaron in his work and the significance of it and why it is so important and why this conversation between art and science is so interesting and potentially transformative in thinking about who we are, what is our relationship to one another and to the earth, and what are we going to do about that. I am a scientist. I'm a card-carrying scientist. I know enough to be dangerous in interdisciplinary settings. I'm very intellectually motivated by them. I find them energizing. It gives me reason and purpose to do science when I'm in conversation with other ways of knowing and ways of thinking about the world around us. So the opportunity to do that in light of Aaron's work is just very exciting. At the Institute on the Environment, we do that in a university setting. We put disciplines in conversation with one another because we're working to build people and build knowledge that is useful in addressing issues of sustainability, social and environmental justice, and that requires capacity. It requires inquisitiveness. It requires ways of seeing the world and looking introspectively as well. And I think there is something magical about the arts and science when they're combined that is profoundly more impactful than either alone in that broader social conversation.
So I think we're kind of dancing around this, and I would love for either one of you, and this is maybe the perfect moment for both of you maybe to talk about. There is this presumption that there is a separation of ways of knowing. You're either a scientist and you're only a scientist, or you're an artist and you're only an artist. And that doesn't factor into the fact that we're all intersectional. We all are parents or people or sons or daughters or exist in the United States today during a pandemic in this heightened moment of stress and tension. So what I love about this is that you're both alluding to that's actually not the case, and that there's this presumption. Can you guys talk about that presumption and how it impacts both of you in your careers and what you're trying to do to maybe dismantle that?
One thing I'm profoundly interested in, I've seen it growing up. I mean, I was actually in art school before I went to normal school. It involves an origin myth of a failed t-ball game and my non-sportiness that my parents put me in art school. So I was in that before that, but I'm really interested in changing the dialogue and this notion that there is an art world and a scientific world. And I think it's kind of ridiculous because it is actually a way to communicate and understand the world around us. I think both, say, genres have kind of self-inflicted this wound. I mean, I look back, I know a lot of art history where it's really insular, it's art about art, and then people turn around and wonder why nobody cares about them. But starting to, as opposed to a world, and it does intersect, of course, but I'm much more interested in the broad sense that it is a way of being in the world and understanding it. And my kind of thesis that I keep coming back to is art's just a way to communicate, just like the language I'm using. It uses visual means in a way to communicate and understand things around us. So it's not like I am choosing a world to play in. It's actually, this is how I see the world. And I'm interested in how, when I talk to true scientists that are doing that, it's that same thing.
I love the idea that you went to, well, there was a failed t-ball game. Presumably you were quite young when that happened.
Very young.
Okay. I think it's sort of an American education system. It's certainly an American higher education, or higher education generally, that says that specialization is what we're striving toward. And we start kids quite young. I definitely came in, Aaron and I, the three of us have talked about this. I mean, I did well in math and science probably when I was in third grade. And so I started being slotted in the math and science. Not that I didn't have a broader appreciation. I always have, which I think is important to me now. But we kind of track students into particular disciplines or ways of knowing. On the one hand, I think that's downright harmful because you are trained in some respects to double back on what it is that you know, rather than being inquisitive about other lanes of knowing, if you will. On the other hand, I do think that specialization and being really excellent at something is remarkable as well. And as long as you pick your head up and engage that specific knowledge with others, that also can be really interesting. So it's funny, we talk a lot at the Institute on the Environment about interdisciplinarity, and maybe we're actually, in doing that, we're perpetuating that there are disciplines and we will cross them, rather than thinking about how it is that it's a much more fluid and interactive setting. But it is also true that there are disciplines and there are ways of knowing, and there is magic in mastery, but they must be in conversation with one another if we're to gain the benefits of multiple perspectives.
I mean, it is that kind of balance, because if we pull back too far, we lose that focus. And I think the idea, and why I didn't posit arts and scientists are the same. I really, I've heard that. I've been involved in multiple cohorts before, and people are like, oh, they're just the same. I'm like, no, they're not. And you'd use the same word to describe them. I think those differences are actually important. How you're orientated to the world, and how that affects your viewpoint and your lens on it. I mean, the metaphor I use in my mind is that everybody has their own little flashlight, right? And you can try to make that as broad as possible, but it's based on how your upbringing, based on societal goals and so forth like that. And everybody points their flashlight at one thing, you'll see more. So if everybody has the same flashlight, you'll just see the same thing. This way, it's this notion of diversity in thought patterns as well. What I love, and why I like to talk to scientists, is we look at the same thing and see it utterly differently. If I'm with somebody, they're like, oh yeah, do you see that? Yeah, and then we'll move on. Where I'm much more interested in, like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but tell me more. That is where growth is. And I think so in that notion of interdisciplinary, it is, I think, to me, what we need to be careful of is that those disciplines become so, and use whatever terminology you want. I think siloed is the preferred one at this point, but because it's more comfortable to talk to people who understand you. I mean, that's just human nature. If you are understood, you're like, oh, you're my people. Where it's stepping out of that notion of understanding. And I look, and what drives me is that passion. When I've talked to many scientists, and some just like, oh, you're great, but we're not right for each other. It's where I trip across somebody that is basically just like, holy shit, look at this. And we can talk about the rationality, the emotion, all this, but they're just like, you can see it in the eyes. You're like, look at this. This is what drives me. This is what I'm about.
So I think we're flipping now to the next work, but Aaron's show comprises two large-scale, you can almost call them monumental works. And this is Dig Down to the Stars, and the work before was Latitude, and I think Latitude gets exactly to that notion of seeing the world two different ways. And so, Aaron, I would love to hear, what is that work, and how do you interpret that work differently than, say, the scientists who culled that data that you used, and how is that data used in your work?
Latitude came from many conversations with a good friend, and he always showed this graph of the Earth breathing. And we had multiple conversations on stage, in private, walking along. And he would keep coming back to this notion that the planet breathes. And it never really struck me until just one day, I'm like, what should we do? Like, if we could tackle and think about any data, what's important? When I ask scientists, I'm like, what story do you want to tell? It needs to be compelling, and the data needs to be dynamic. Because if you have a compelling story but the data is flat, it's going to be boring. So started talking about these eddy covariance flux towers. I always get that term wrong, but it's basically nodes, towers all across the globe that sample the environment, sample atmospheric gas. But what intrigues me is there's a directionality to it. It's not just the amount, it's where it's moving. In my mind, thinking there is FluxNet, where we got pulled a lot of the data from. There's data sets all over the place. I mean, let's face it, the world's infested with data. We have so much, we can't do anything with it. And a certain subset of people know what that means and can learn from it. And again, that specialty of driving down is really important. You can communicate, you can grow, but how do you reach a broader audience? And honestly, I start to pull just what makes me happy? When I look at it, I'm like, oh my God, that's just amazing. Part of this work has involved mirror balls. Each time I pull one out of a box, I just get giddy. I'm like, oh my God, look at this. Look at the lights. Just look at the lights. I feel like a raccoon. And then these, those dancing noodle people, whatever they're called, in front of that, they're ubiquitous, and they're goofy. They're pop culture, but you know what? They're just hysterical, and you can't take your eyes off them. So trying to just, in my mind, jam things together, be like, okay, what's important and how can we talk about it? I'm like, well, you know what? Nobody likes to look at graphs, but when you see a dancing person outside of a cell phone store, you laugh. You're like, you know what? That's hysterical. So how can you kind of use that language to talk about something that actually matters?
Can I say something about this data? So these eddy flux towers, right? They are towers. They have a bunch of sensors across elevation, and they're located in many, many, many places around the world. And the network of them is this FluxNet. And so you're able to collate, you collected a bunch of data and then aggregate them by latitude, right? Mm-hmm. So they're much finer than that. They're also, you're showing the data set through time. You can also look at the data through different layers of the atmosphere. So when you say the Earth is breathing, these instruments are so fine that they measure a very localized concentration of gases in the atmosphere, like literally right around that sensor. And so you can watch the Earth seasonally suck in CO2. You can see it flux. It flows past the sensors in the tower as the Earth is in the northern hemisphere, because most of the land in the Earth is in the northern hemisphere. So that's where a lot of the plants live. So in the springtime, they suck in a lot of this carbon dioxide, and that's the breathing in. And then at the fall, they're respiring, and that material is flowing back into the atmosphere. And that in and out and in and out is this baseline pattern. But then on top of that is this in and out and in and out and in and out that's creeping up and up and up and up and up. And what I think is fascinating about that data set is that as a climate-related person, I see those data and I see some sort of call to action. It's stressful. And what you're you're interweaving that data set into, as you say, a pop culture concept. You're inviting people to look at it. It's a color, it's dynamic, it's in motion. And to me, when I see that piece, it also asks me, and then what do I think about it? And then implicitly, what am I going to do about it? And as a scientist, I think the data set is interesting. I think it's fascinating. We're learning all kinds of things, but it also invites me to ask, what am I going to do about it? And then we can talk about the other piece, which I also think says similarly, what are we going to do about it on some different points?
It's, I think too often the conversation starts like, what are we going to do about it? As opposed to what's happening.
Yeah, here it is.
You know, if we face trauma or face terror, the idea that you have to act is not a question. You're just like, oh my God, we got to do something. As opposed to, oh my God, we got to do something. Well, what's wrong? The way I look at it, the first article that talked about greenhouse gases and the effects was in 1953 in Popular Mechanics. We've known about this for decades. We've used the same language over and over and over again. If I say climate change to everybody, everybody knows. They're like, oh, I know what you're talking about. It's this assumption. They shut down. There's no entry point. And a lot of my past work, I like to be really underhanded. I love humor, and I love joy in the way that it can loosen people up and be like, yeah, but wait. And to me, the humor is always really dark. It's just like, oh, that's joke. Oh my God. Where it is that if I tell you what you need to do, I personally am tired of people telling me what to do. And it's also, if somebody yells at me, I can guarantee you I'm not going to listen. You know, it's just like, you could be right. I don't care. So how do we reframe this conversation? How do we get out of the idea of politics? In the interview, it was posted online with Sue, one of the scientists that helped me correlate the data, as we talked about, well, how do you feel a need to advocate? And she's like, I don't think it's advocation, it's just education. As she put it, I loved this quote with all my heart. It's like, if I'm a mechanic and I know your brakes are broken, I need to tell you your brakes are broken. And that's my job. It's not that I'm advocating for a better world. I'm just like, yo, your brakes are broken. You should not be driving. So the idea that to just get a new entry point, and just to get people maybe caught off guard, because if you first see this piece, it's colorful, it's beautiful, and then you can start to see that, like, oh, it's based on these things, and it has those kind of onion layers behind it. But you need to get people into the conversation before you start talking about it, because if you're like, oh, hey, do you want to talk about the climate? You're like, no, actually, I really don't.
I think that taps into something about not only your show and your practice, Aaron, but this talk today is actually being co-presented with a festival that's been going on for 2 weeks, the Great Northern Festival. And that whole festival is about getting outside and celebrating the North, but it's also about our climate and the change and recognizing that, hey, our brakes are broken. Things are rapidly shifting. How does that impact, say, the work that you're doing, Jessica? Does that bring greater awareness? Is it more complicated? What are the end results, and where do we go from here? What is next? What do we do about it? Not to load that question too much.
I appreciate, Aaron, your point that no one wants to be talked at necessarily. No one needs to be. Certainly the sort of guilt dimensions, we're all responsible, you ought to be doing something, it immediately sets off sort of a number of defensive alarm bells. And to hear you talk about the joy of, like, the motion of the car dealer, there's a word for them. They're not little guys without
I think they're just
arms.
called flippy floppy whaley men.
I honestly don't know what they are. I just call them noodle dancers.
Noodle dancers,
I don't know why.
Noodle dancers. I actually think that for those of us who do work with those data sets, yes, the data sets say the brakes are broken, but we also are just really interested in brakes and the operation of the vehicle. Just like your expression of the data set is exciting, interesting, provocative, it does lead to a question of what are we going to do about it, but that's not all that it has to say. I feel that way too about the data. I don't pursue science exclusively because because I'm trying to save the world. I'm very interested in fixing the brakes because I can see them, but I also just love being a mechanic. And I do think there's a lot of similarity between the arts and the sciences that way, right? So I feel that if we're going to embrace society in what are ultimately shared pursuits, we cannot stand around arguing about who ought to be doing what. We have to be deciding what we're willing to do together. And it's not just about the environment, because the environment interfaces with every other social shortcoming, striving, equity, justice dilemma that we have that we must address to become better people. All of those things ultimately invite us to say, what are we willing to do together? And I think science needs to be part of that conversation. It has a lot to contribute in concert with others. And that's what an arts festival, educational opportunities, dialogue across difference. I know it's hard, but ultimately I believe those are the places where we'll find traction about what we can strive toward, not just pile on the guilt of how we ought to be doing better, but what we are willing to do going forward, which requires a much deeper appreciation and awe and joy than tragedy.
No, I what I like is you talk about, to reference past things, of this notion of speciality is important, to dive down is important, but to keep your head up. To start kind of pulling back, and I think, we're on the backs of giants, right? Like I can do this work because of all the artists that came before me, not only that. So we tend to focus on that digging down. I mean, I've met a lot of artists, a lot of scientists that only like to talk to other artists and scientists. I mean, we joked when we met, if you introduce yourself as an artist, the first thing somebody will say is like, oh, I can't draw. And I'm like, I what? And then you're just like, if you're a scientist, you're like, oh, I'm bad at math. I'm like, what? I don't really understand how that matters. But to talk about this notion of, while you're digging down, to be able to kind of operate at the same time without such specifics. And I forgot the artist, and I apologize, but I got to see an artist talk, and I'm usually not really inspired, but I remember this person saying, and he presented work where it was a time lapse of, say, a cabbage growing, and it was actually presented next to a cabbage in the supermarket. And he said, I think I get tired of the fact of whether organic or conventional is better. We actually just need to remind people that, your food comes from the ground.
Yeah, it's cabbage.
Yeah, if you knew that the food came from dirt, that's where you get your food, not a store, but from the dirt, we would be a lot nicer to the dirt. So I think to circle back, to start thinking about the specificity of science. What I love about it that people often forget about is that it's based on this notion that we probably can never fully know something, right? That there is this is the best we have right now. And what I love about it is you're kind of excited to be proven wrong because something new is learned. And I can go into labs, fancy labs, talk about modeled data, see these fancy things, and I love that. But stepping back of tapping into both that specificity, but also just that passion that we are in a shared environment, that we are actually looking at the same thing.
Yeah, and it's a practice. Science is ultimately a practice of an approach and a methodology. Actually, to hear what you were just saying about the cabbage makes me think of your other piece too. I don't want to jump ahead, but when I first saw that, walk into the first piece and see this root ball with mirrors.
It's right behind you here.
Oh, perfect. I said to you, where did this tree come from and what is it? And I immediately started, you can tell certain things about the living environment that this is definitely an urban specimen. You can tell because of the way its root structure is working and how it's striving to find water and nutrients in a particular environment. And that was my first reaction as a biologist, is this is a living organism, what is its story? But there are so many different ways of looking at it. But I do, when I see cabbage, I see cabbages. When I see root balls, I see trees.
That's kind of the nice thing, though. Like, I think, it's in there, and I think in the art world, and especially in, let's face it, a fancy pants museum, that there's this notion that there's only kind of one way to view an object, right?
Yeah.
And I get, and it wasn't much of a fight because Nicole knows me, we've known each other for a bit, and my kind of hatred of long didactics, because I'm a person that puts objects on display, so part of my role is to understand how people look at objects. So I watch that, and I get really disheartened when people actually read what the piece is about first before they look at the work. And that's kind of why I didn't want a lot of signage here. Because that's valid, right? I can talk about what I put in that piece, what it's about for me. But I think the most powerful thing that an artist can do is, especially when it's an object, is kind of put this thing out into the world that comes from your singular experience, but really touches on kind of universal constants, that there are those inputs. I'm fascinated about trees and roots for very specific reasons, some of them of what you mentioned, but other notions of just the metaphorical ties, and from material flows and how we think about location, objectness, space, all that kind of stuff. And what I love about artwork is the answer is yes, and it's also that.
I just want to pull a thread here, and and that thread is information framing an object or a story. Because the reason why museums actually have shortened their labels, even though it feels long and lengthy if you're not used to it, is that people actually will walk out of a gallery because they feel like they can't access the work. Because there is this perception that there is only one right way, not platitudes, but singular definition. And as a museum specialist, I can give you all the data you would want, and I know I start to glaze over about page 5 of the annual reports, but the truth of the matter is that people, we have, it goes back to our initial question, I think. People have these presumptions that there's only one way to operate. Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of goes to this, what you do so beautifully, Aaron, and what I think you and your work has done so beautifully is to say, yes, and. Yes, there might be a right or wrong way to say, it's obviously not a Van Gogh, but it's a tree in the gallery. And there's more ways to interpret that. Yeah. I think, so this maybe brings us back to this initial question that I have is, why do we retain those presumptions of only one right way, and how do we as specialists start to break those down?
Well, you also said, okay, so a scientist and an artist walk into a museum. So I definitely do every one of us walks in with our lived experience and what we know, right? So I see a tree, I'm a biologist, I say that's a tree. But then I start to slowly say, okay, well, what else is going on here? And what else do I think about it? And I begin to get outside of my science head or what I know and think about other sets of things. And that's what I think is, so that's the and, right? And the fact that, but you also have to be willing. And so when we work collaboratively between the sciences and the arts, we need scientists who say, okay, my boundaries do not end at my scientific understanding of this tree. And I'm willing to open my mind more from that point. I also think it's really interesting, personally, that the noodles move and they seem alive, but it's actually the tree that was alive. The noodles are not alive. So very, very much about our perception of what constitutes sort of something that seems more people-like is in some ways more living to us or more interesting. But
and I think this is the first time I've shown in a gallery in a while. I mean, a lot of my work has been out in the world, and that's important to me. I think I'm interested in making work that engages with people, not just necessarily an art crowd. I mean, I purposely stayed away from art school on purpose because, again, that's the language I wanted to use. Much more important to me is what did I want to say with it? Like how do I think with that language? Here, what I like about me is I feel fancy, and who doesn't like to feel fancy? But in addition to this, it's an encyclopedic museum that people go to. It's free. Its goal is to be accessible and to try to break down those barriers, to be both a specialist, I mean, the collection's amazing here, but also to say, like, why don't you just look at it? Like, it's for everybody. I mean, I remember when one of the, let's say the Target wing opened and the admissions fee went away, and the museum had a giant grand opening inflatable gorilla over the doorway. And I'm like, this is my place. I'm like, I love that kind of notion, like, hey, we do fancy things here, but that doesn't mean to be fancy. I mean, thinking about breaking it down, for me, first and foremost, I'm interested in communicating about kind of deep truths because this is what I think about. But like, if there's not a hook, if it's not fun, if it doesn't look beautiful, for me, it's not successful. Because if people don't know that Latitude is based on this data, knows this notion of what a carbon sink is, that the planet breathes at different ways across latitudes, all that kind of stuff, in the end, like, I've seen like 4-year-olds just in awe of just watching it. I'm like, and because it's goofy, it's transfixing, and that's a level of success. And that's what I try to do and lead with all of that. With the root ball, like that, I honestly still don't really know what's happening with that piece. It was kind of a stand-in when I applied for the show, because I was thinking, I love the notion of the difference of saying that, do you branch out or do you have deep roots, and that directionality of location and place. But then starting to think about roots, kind of just had this vision listening to a song of roots like breaking through the earth and turning into the stars, and how our planet relates to other planets, and very local to very global, to universality. But having it seem that kind of poetic counterpart, that in the end it's a kind of a weird transfixing root ball in the middle of this beautiful blue room, that's where I lead, and that's what I want to start with, as opposed to, I can go on and on about all my art thoughts, but again, I have those, they're important to me, and I talk about them in Spain because that's my specialty, but I need to lead with kind of a much broader strokes.
Well, on that note, I'm going to invite the audience that are in the room to ask any questions, and so like my colleagues to help pass along the mics. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I know we're in Minnesota, so it'll be a beat before we do this. But I invite you guys to ask and inquire, and to maybe bring more depth to our conversation today. Front row. And I do ask that when you're handed the mic, to please speak into the mic before you ask the question, because this video is being recorded and will be held in posterity on our website. But also for the folks at home and for folks with audio disabilities or complications, they can't always hear you in the back of the room. So go ahead.
Oh, cool. Okay.
It's live. It works.
Neat. And this is a question for both of you guys. I think it's always really fascinating when we're talking about such complex questions. And as scientists and artists do deal with complexities, but we are also tasked with paring them down. So how, with this huge amount of knowledge and possibilities, how do you narrow that down? Like, Is it just a matter of something that sings to you, or is it more of a calculated exploration of from point A to point B?
I'll go. It's what I love. Like, my artwork is always based on my passion, that I just find interesting at its most basic. I started working with mirror balls because they're awesome. And then I found, oh my God, they do all of these things. I mean, you spoke to being, just wanting to be a mechanic. Everything I do, because if I don't do something that I'm passionate about, I won't stick with it. This stuff is hard. I haven't had a big project that hasn't really broken me. But I've come to realize and start to think about the ubiquitous follow your dream statement. And it's not because things will be dreamy, it's because you'll actually push through and get to the dream through all the trouble and turmoil. And if it's somebody else's dream, you'll give up. So for me, it is something that sings to me. It is something, whether it is the data, whether it is that story, or whether it's like, I like shiny things and colorful lights. And in the end, I just try to jam them together.
Your question made me think a little bit, if I could flip it upside down, because it feels worth pointing out in this context that there are ways that scientists think about art that I think are not productive. And they're doing it because they think they are trying to simplify a message. And they look to the arts as a communications tool. So no one understands my stuff. If I could just find an artist, they would make it cool and simplified, and then everyone would completely get it, right? If I could find a beautiful way of portraying this temperature data profile. And that doesn't feel, that tends not to work. I mean, rather than getting an artist, you can get like a marketing firm or something, right? It seems more substantive in my experience, and my experience is limited. I'm still learning how to operate in this type of space. But when you can take the best of whomever in a collaboration brings to the table and do something jointly that's unique in a form of inquiry and discovery in both areas. So that's why, to hear Aaron talk about his work to me is still sometimes surprising, because there's aspects of that work that I don't fully understand or I haven't discovered myself yet, and that's what makes it art. So I do think there's a lot we can do together, but I also know sometimes, especially on the science side, which I'm more familiar with, some scientists don't understand what art can achieve, and they oversimplify it, and I think to the detriment of the potential relationship. And that just felt relevant to your question. I'm not sure it directly answered it, but
I still love the answer, so thank you.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Do we have any other questions? Right over here.
So I heard you guys talking about, these pieces are all about your specialties, that you also want them to be inclusive. So I'd kind of like to hear a little bit more about how specialties and inclusion works. And then also just things I noticed about the piece that I'd love to hear a little bit more about the movement aspect. And kind of how, if these two pieces kind of have similarities in movement, because I see similar shapes in Latitude as I do in this piece as well.
The second question's a little bit easier, but I think coming from an art career, I mean, I went through many years of school. I teach in a school, and what I like is I teach at a community college, and thinking about this idea that, again, art is not something that's for a certain set of people. Like, oh my God, the amount of times I've heard, well, I'm not creative. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, actually, it's usually you don't allow yourselves to be creative. And the idea, trying to be this notion of inclusivity, that there is one right answer. and that people's orientation to the work is going to be different, and that's actually part of the awesome part, stripping down that notion that there is kind of one kind of right answer. Do you have something? I can obviously answer the movement part, but
Yeah, you should answer the other part, but I'll toss in.
Sure.
I think inclusivity is profoundly important because we, especially with respect to, again, social and environmental issues and a need to build a future, everyone needs to has something to contribute to that, one. Also, I think scientists have been slow to understand the significance of inclusion because we have this notion of objectivity that's false. I personally bring a lot to my science from my lived experience. I am an environmental scientist. I'm also a mom. I bring with me a lot of privilege and opportunity that has enabled me to be successful in my career, but I also fit outside of the mold of some notions of my discipline. And this is one of the reasons why I love to teach in high-heeled shoes. I love high-heeled shoes, and I love coming to a science class in my high-heeled shoes and saying, here I am, and I like high-heeled shoes. And that's my own tiny little form of my version of who I am, and I add something to my discipline. And I think ultimately that's why inclusion is so important, because it is about inquiry and striving, and everyone's perspective has something to contribute. Now you should speak to you.
So the notion of movement between these two pieces is actually really important to me. If we look at Latitude, which is the big noodle dancers, it's the rainbow piece, the movement's obvious, right? They're flopping. It's both elegant, goofy, and captivating. But it's speaking to a process that we can't see. Number one, it's very slow. These gases don't just kind of explode out of the ground. Also, it's transparent. We can't visually have that. And a lot of climate issues and climate change issues, I look at it, part of the issue is the cause and the effect are way too distanced for us to actually do something about it. If you hit your head on the wall, you'll never do it again because you hit it and it hurts. A lot of the actions that caused what we're at, it just happened decades ago. So it isn't like, oh, you have to rationally make the leap from this to that to understand what's happening. The dig down to the stars piece, the movement is subtle to the point where I would go to venture. Most people that go through the gallery might not even notice it. It moves 1 revolution per hour. And part of that is what I'm really interested in the notion of is the stars on the gallery wall. But also, I wanted to kind of mess with you a little bit. I think it's kind of goofy and it just makes me laugh. And I actually just visited the piece and 2 people were in there were like, I think it's moving. No, it's not. And we had plenty of conversations with staff and so forth of having to put tape down and figuring out if it's moving or not. But also, it rewards slow viewing. And I see these 2 pieces as different, but having a conversation to actually understand what's happening, we need to slow down, and we need to be rewarded. I think, especially in contemporary society, and I'm guilty of this as well, we reward multitasking and being busy. And multitasking basically is just doing a bunch of stuff terribly, right? So how do we slow down to pay attention to the earth breathing? Part of the notion of why I'm interested in this notion of breath is it's part of mindfulness meditation as well. It is to focus on the breath, which is both an automatic response of your body, but it's one we can control, so it bounces back and forth. But it's also how you pull the outside in. You actually bring the world into your body and you let it go. And as it kind of comes in forward, you actually are part of the environment. But you need to slow down to really understand what that means. Obviously, it means something weirdly, oddly different in a pandemic, but I planned the piece before that. But the notion of trying to say, for me, for movement, is one's painfully slow. though what I've noticed, having spent time in it, it actually, you find your body accustomed to seeing the movement. And if I spend time with it, when I leave the gallery, I think it's moving too fast. When I go in, I'm like, crap, is it moving? Like, is it broken? And then I sit, and then if I spend some time with it, by the time I'm out the door, I'm like, actually, I should have not made it so fast.
I will actually just add on to that. Our number one comment for the show is that the work is broken because people expect movement to be quick. People expect things to be in a state of spectacle when you have time-based media. And and that doesn't go just for your work, but for any work that I install that involves slowness or meditation, it is often perceived as not functioning. And I just want to leave that with the crowd, like, because I think just to pick up exactly what you're saying is, I think we have to give ourselves, especially after 3 years, 2 years of living slower, I think we have to ask, what is the value and how do we carry on that value?
And just as a side note, I can control that speed. So the programmer I worked with made a phone app, so I have a slider that I can control the speed. So because as I talked, the first inclination was to have it spin 24 hours a day. I mean, one rotation a day to talk to the planet rotation. And I realized conceptually that's amazing. Like visually it's going to be boring. There's no way you could see it. And I'm interested in the balance of interpretation and concept and aesthetics. But the idea was, I'm like, I don't know how fast I want it. And so it was built in to be variable. What I noticed is if it spun too fast, it felt like a display. I think like there's both beauty in that, but it's also really sad. Those roots are dead, they're turned upside down, and they're slowly on display. We're in a building that shows objects, and its mission is to protect them at all costs, as opposed to this living thing that once was. So when it spun faster, it looked like, like one of those cake displays at a diner. And I'm like, I'm not trying to advertise this as some sort of object. I want that kind of darkness to be really deep down and be like, oh wait, but these roots are not in the dirt anymore. And to have it be kind of beautiful at first and then slightly undercutting. So when it spun fast and you could actually easily see it spin, it actually felt, pardon me, I was a little bit disturbed. I'm like, that's actually kind of gross. Yeah, it was super creepy.
So on that creepy note, we have time for one more short question. Does anyone have any more questions? Well, with that, then I will wrap up today's conversation by saying thank you to our partners at the Great Northern Festival. Kate Nordstrom and her team have been amazing. Today is the last day. If you have not had the opportunity to scope it out, please do go to their website. It is a living archive of everything that's gone on and what will continue to go on this evening. So please do check out the Great Northern online. And I also want to encourage you guys, today's the last day of The Conservatory by Andy Doucette and Jovan C. Speller. Jovan will be the next artist for our MAEP program. Her exhibition, Nurturing and Other Rituals of Protection, will open in mid-March. So with that, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Jessica. Please do check out the ION-E at the U of M's website for their future programs, and check out artsmia.org for future programs here and exhibitions. Thank you all today.